Imagine this. It's dawn, May 29, 1453. The walls of Constantinople, once the pride of the Christian world, tremble as smoke coils into a blood-colored sky. Bells clash with the thunder of cannons. And there, astride a black horse draped in crimson silk, sits a man barely 21. His armor glints like obsidian. His eyes are calm, unblinking. That man was Mehmed II, Mehmed the Conqueror. To his followers, he was the hand of destiny. To his enemies, he was the end of an age. When the final breach tore through the ancient Theodosian walls, witnesses said the city itself seemed to cry out. Priests carried icons through the streets. People knelt, kissing the stones, begging for mercy. But mercy would not come. Mehmed had already given his command. The city is yours, for 3 days. What followed was not a battle. It was judgment. Churches were looted, relics seized, homes stripped bare. In Hagia Sophia, desperate citizens had barricaded themselves inside, praying for deliverance. When the gates fell, silence followed, the kind of silence that comes when history changes shape. Can you imagine that moment, the sound of faith collapsing beneath the echo of cannon fire? Even before that day, Mehmed had shown the world what defiance would cost. When a Venetian ship ignored his order and tried to pass through the Bosphorus, he stopped it with cannon fire. The surviving sailors were punished publicly, their captain was raised on a stake at the shoreline, a warning written in flesh. It wasn't cruelty for its own sake. It was policy. A message carved into the horizon, this sea now belongs to me. The captain on the stake, 1453, recorded by Venetian chroniclers. One Byzantine account claims that when Mehmed entered Hagia Sophia, he looked up at the golden dome where Christ's image still shimmered and whispered, "There is no God but Allah." Then he ordered the church purified and consecrated for worship, this time, as a mosque. Whether it happened exactly that way or not, the moment became legend. The instant when a 1,000-year empire fell to the will of a boy who believed he was chosen by heaven. But who was he, really? A visionary, or a monster? A scholar king, or a tyrant who treated terror as an art? Because what happened in Constantinople was only the beginning. Behind the armor and the triumph was a mind forged in the belief that fear was the purest form of control. That a ruler's glory was measured not by how many followed him, but by how many trembled at his name. They called him Fadi, the conqueror. But to those who faced him, the name meant something else. It meant doom. When dawn rose after that first night, the city was still. Smoke drifted above the ruins. The once proud palaces of emperors stood open to the wind. Inside the imperial halls, Mehmed sat on a gilded throne surrounded by the spoils of empire, crowns, crosses, jeweled swords. He lifted one ornate diadem, studied it for a moment, and murmured. So much blood, for a stone. To him, conquest was not destruction, it was creation. He would rebuild this city as his capital, the heart of a new world. But first, every trace of the old order had to be erased. Bodies of fallen soldiers were carried to the Bosphorus. Captives divided among victors, as war demanded. The corpse of Emperor Constantine XI was found among the dead. Many say Mehmed covered it with a purple cloak and said, "He fought like a man." A rare moment of respect amid conquest, reverence and ruthlessness in the same breath. Venetian envoys wrote that he kept a small book of names, rivals, nobles, traitors. After each victory, he would strike out a name with the point of his dagger. Sometimes he smiled. Sometimes he didn't. To his court, he spoke of destiny. To his army, he promised paradise. To his prisoners, he spoke only in silence. When Constantinople fell, the world shuddered. Pope Nicholas V called it the second death of Christendom. Merchants in Venice whispered that Mehmed drank blood to keep his strength. Ottoman historians claimed he slept little, haunted by dreams of conquest. But truth and legend had already merged, because both served the same purpose, fear. And that fear would become his greatest weapon, sharper than any blade. Before he was the conqueror, he was just a boy, born into a world that believed compassion was a flaw. Mehmed's story began not with tenderness, but with expectation. He was the son of Sultan Murad II, a warrior who saw mercy as a sickness of the heart. From the moment Mehmed could walk, he was surrounded by steel, soldiers, tutors, guards, executioners. His cradle was cedar, his lullabies were prayers for victory. When other children learned to read, Mehmed learned to command. At 7, he was handed a sword. At 12, a province, and left alone to rule it. That was his father's lesson: throw the boy into fire and see if he burns or hardens. He hardened. Ottoman chroniclers describe his education as a fusion of faith and ferocity. His tutors drilled into him that God himself had chosen him to expand the empire, Gaza, the holy war. He memorized the Quran, studied Greek philosophy, Latin treatises, military strategy. But what he mastered best was control. One account tells of a young servant who disobeyed an order. Mehmed, barely 13, punished him harshly. When a vizier protested, the boy simply said, "A ruler who cannot command fear will never rule." No one questioned him again. Even then, witnesses described him as distant, a calm voice, an unblinking stare. A Venetian envoy later wrote that his silence was worse than anger, it made men tremble, because they never knew whether he would punish or reward. That unpredictability became his most powerful weapon. Stop and picture that, a child whose presence alone could make grown men afraid to breathe. But power came at a price. At 15, his father abdicated, leaving Mehmed ruler of an empire he was too young to control. The Janissaries, the elite soldiers, rebelled, storming the palace. While panic spread, Mehmed stood in the courtyard and faced them. He didn't flee. He ordered the gates opened and said, "If you want the throne, come take it." They hesitated. Moments later, Murad returned with the army, crushed the revolt, and reclaimed the throne. For most sons, it would have been humiliation. For Mehmed, revelation. He learned that fear was the only loyalty that never faded. Love was fleeting. Obedience endured. After that, stories say he kept a dagger under his pillow, not from fear of assassins, but as a reminder never to be weak again. He would sharpen the blade before sleep, every night. Some said he spoke to it. Others swore he prayed to it. No one dared ask which was true. In his teenage years, he surrounded himself with scholars, poets, mystics, and executioners. He read by candlelight about Alexander the Great, Caesar, and Cyrus. He wanted to outdo them all. They conquered nations, he once told a tutor. I will conquer faiths. Was it arrogance, or prophecy? No one knew yet. By 19, Mehmed had become a paradox, a philosopher with a sword, a poet who believed blood could shape destiny. He could quote Aristotle in one breath, and in the next, give an order that ended a life. One tale tells of a rebel captured and brought before him. Mehmed invited the man to dine at his table. The prisoner ate nervously, believing he might be pardoned. After the meal, Mehmed thanked him politely, then ordered his death. When asked why, he said, "A man dies only once. Let it be in comfort." True or not, the story spread like wildfire, because it sounded exactly like him. And soon, cruelty would stop being rumor and become law. After taking the throne for good, he decreed the Sultan's right to eliminate his brothers, for the order of the world. It became known as the law of fratricide, a rule that made survival itself an act of politics. Chroniclers say he invoked it without hesitation, setting a precedent that would haunt the empire for centuries. Think about that, a law built not to prevent bloodshed, but to authorize it. To Mehmed, mercy was weakness. Order was sacred. And peace could be built only on the certainty of fear. Everything in his life had been preparation for one purpose. The conquest of the unconquerable city. Constantinople, the jewel of empires, the dream of his ancestors, the city that had defied every siege for 1,000 years. He saw it not as a fortress, but as destiny. And destiny, to Mehmed, was never granted. It was taken, by force. The year was 1453. For more than 11 centuries, Constantinople had stood as the wall between two worlds, Christian Europe and the rising East. But that spring, the defenders looked down from the ancient ramparts and saw a sight that froze their blood. The horizon was moving. An ocean of tents, banners, and glimmering steel, the Ottoman host. Tens of thousands of men, ranks stretching beyond sight. Cannons the size of towers. Drums that made the earth itself tremble. At their head rode Mehmed II, barely 21, in black armor trimmed with gold, his eyes fixed on the walls as if he could already see through them. Either I conquer the city, he told his generals, or the city buries me beneath its stones. Even before the siege began, he sent his message across the water. A Venetian ship dared to test his command, slipping through the Bosphorus against his decree. The gunners answered without hesitation. The ship was seized, her crew punished, and the captain raised on a stake by the shore where every sailor could see him. For 3 days he hung there, a warning written in flesh and silence, telling the world what awaited defiance. It was not cruelty for cruelty's sake. It was rule through fear. And the city understood that language. Then the siege began. By day, his great bombards, designed by the Hungarian engineer Orban, hurled stones that shook the Theodosian walls to their foundations. By night, his men filled moats and raised siege towers that clawed toward the sky. Inside the city, Emperor Constantine XI Palaiologos led a desperate defense with scarcely 7,000 men. They prayed in Hagia Sophia and swore that angels would come to protect them. But angels never came. On a moonless night, Mehmed gave a daring order. Launch the ships over the land. And the impossible happened. In silence, his soldiers hauled dozens of ships across greased wooden tracks, dragging them over the hill that blocked the Golden Horn. When dawn broke, the defenders stared in disbelief. Ottoman warships floated behind their walls, inside the harbor they thought was safe. Can you picture that? Ships sliding over mountains as if the laws of the world had bent to his will. The city was surrounded, by land, by water, and by fate itself. Priests led processions through the streets, carrying icons and relics. Women wept, children hid in the churches. Chroniclers wrote of omens, voices singing in the night, the statue of the Virgin turning her face from the east. Inside his tent, Mehmed watched the glow of fires and whispered. Even your God has left you. Was it arrogance, or prophecy fulfilled? The final assault came at dawn on May 29. Ottoman horns blared, drums thundered, and the walls shuddered under a storm of fire and steel. The Janissaries, the Sultan's elite, surged through the breaches, their banners rising above the ruins. Eyewitnesses wrote that the air itself seemed to scream. Greek fire lit the sky like the wrath of heaven. By midday, the gate of St. Romanus was broken, and the empire that had called itself eternal began to die. Constantine XI refused to flee. He threw off his imperial cloak, drew his sword, and vanished into the melee. Some said Mehmed ordered his body searched for days, others whispered he found the fallen emperor himself and murmured. He was a lion among men. Whatever the truth, the emperor was dead, and the city was lost. For 3 days, the victors claimed their spoils, as was the brutal custom of war. Churches were plundered, palaces stripped, captives taken. And Hagia Sophia, once the greatest church in Christendom, became the symbol of both conquest and grief. One story tells that when Mehmed entered the cathedral, the high priest was still chanting the liturgy. As the doors burst open, the priest vanished into the marble wall, hidden by God until the city becomes Christian again. No one ever found him. True or not, the tale spread like wildfire, turning the city's fall into a biblical tragedy. Beneath the vast dome of Hagia Sophia, Mehmed dismounted and stood in silence. He looked up at the fading mosaics of Christ and the saints, then bent down, scooped a handful of dust, and let it fall through his fingers. What a city we have taken, he said softly. And how empty it already feels. He ordered the cathedral cleansed and consecrated as a mosque. Soon, the first call to prayer rose above the city that had once sworn eternal loyalty to Christ. When word reached Europe, panic followed. Venice's bells tolled in mourning. Rome held masses for the dead. One chronicler wrote. The cross has fallen. The crescent has risen. The world has changed forever. And in the east, Mehmed smiled. He had not only conquered a city, he had conquered a prophecy. The young ruler who began the war ended it as something else entirely. To his people, he was the new Alexander. To his enemies, the new Antichrist. But to himself, he was only getting started. Conquest had made him a king. But fear would make him a god. After Constantinople fell, Mehmed became more than a conqueror, he became an architect. He ordered the shattered capital rebuilt as Istanbul, the city of Islam. Masons, artists, and scholars were summoned from every corner of the empire. Mosques rose where churches once stood, markets reopened, fountains and caravanserais brought life back to the streets. He repopulated the city through mass relocations, Surgan, drawing Greeks, Armenians, and Turks alike to restore its pulse. He even appointed the theologian Gennadius Scholarius as patriarch, ensuring that Orthodox Christians had a leader under his rule. Sounds almost merciful, doesn't it? But beneath the marble and calligraphy, there was rot, because Mehmed governed by one law above all others, obedience through fear. And sometimes, even triumph demanded a sacrifice. When the dust of conquest settled, he turned to those who had doubted him. His Grand Vizier, Kandarli Halil Pasha, the man who had warned against attacking Constantinople, was seized and executed. The city had fallen exactly as Mehmed predicted, and his vengeance was as precise as his cannons. It was not rage. It was punctuation, the ruler's way of saying, the age of hesitation is over. He surrounded himself with silence. Those who served him never knew what pleased him or what might cost their lives. A smile could precede a reward, or an execution. A Greek chronicler wrote that he once invited his generals to a feast. The wine flowed, music played, and when laughter reached its height, he had them quietly removed and executed. When asked why, he supposedly said, "They were loyal. But loyalty dies faster than fear." Stories like this multiplied. Whether true or not, belief alone was enough to rule. In his empire, fear became currency. Whispers of his wrath traveled faster than his armies. A rumor could subdue a city before the first cannon fired. Foreign envoys described a ruler of contradictions, courteous, learned, soft-spoken, and terrifying. He could debate theology with monks, then, hours later, sign death warrants without raising his voice. One Venetian ambassador wrote, "He speaks of peace with a poet's tongue, and of death with a surgeon's calm." But even the most feared rulers eventually meet someone who does not tremble. For Mehmed, that man was Vlad III of Wallachia, Vlad the Impaler. Once an Ottoman ally, even a hostage of Mehmed's own court, Vlad turned against him. He refused tribute and sent back the Sultan's envoys, without their heads. Enraged, Mehmed marched north with a vast army, determined to crush the defiance himself. What he found in the forests of Wallachia was not an army waiting to fight, it was silence. And then, horror. Ottoman accounts describe the approach to Targovist as a vision from hell. Thousands of bodies impaled on wooden stakes, stretching across the hills like a forest of death. The stench hung in the air, crows circled in black clouds, and even the hardened janissaries stopped in their tracks. At the center, legend says, sat Vlad on a makeshift throne among the dead, watching in silence. Among those he displayed was Hamza Pasha, Mehmed's own commander, raised higher than all others, a cruel mirror held up to his master. For a moment, Mehmed looked upon the scene and said quietly, "It seems we have met a man who understands me." Was it awe, or disgust? No one knows. But soon after, Mehmed withdrew. Wallachia burned, yet remained unconquered. Ask yourself, what does it take to make even the conqueror turn back? Back in Istanbul, the legends grew darker. People whispered that the Sultan kept the heads of his enemies preserved in jars beneath Topkapi Palace. Others swore he built a hidden chamber where traitors were strangled behind silk-lined walls so their cries would never echo. No proof was ever found, but truth no longer mattered. The myth itself ruled more effectively than steel. To his subjects, Mehmed became the shadow that never slept. They said he rode through the city in disguise, listening to the people. Those who spoke against him were gone by morning. One rumor told of a merchant caught cheating customers. The next day his shop reopened, with a sign of punishment so public that no one ever repeated his mistake. Another claimed Mehmed tested his guards by sneaking past them at night. If they failed to stop him, they were executed for negligence. If they succeeded, they were rewarded. No one knew which fate was worse. And yet, to his admirers, he was no tyrant but a visionary. He built libraries, sponsored scholars, and gathered Greek philosophers at his court. He spoke 7 languages, collected rare manuscripts, and drafted his canon name, the imperial code that shaped Ottoman law for centuries, even granting princes the right to eliminate rivals, for the order of the world. To Mehmed, cruelty and enlightenment were not opposites. They were tools. And he was the hand that wielded them both. By the time the world began to whisper his name with dread, Mehmed II was no longer a man, he was a storm. He ruled from Constantinople to the Balkans, from the Aegean to the Black Sea. Cities bent their knees, kings sent him gold, and priests prayed he would never look their way. But the higher the mountain, the darker its shadow. And the shadow that followed Mehmed was his own. Inside his palace at Topkapi, the once celebrated conqueror became a prisoner of silence. He trusted no one, not viziers, not guards, not even his sons. He changed his sleeping quarters each night, surrounded by eunuchs who never spoke and servants replaced every week. One chronicler wrote that he had mirrors removed from his chambers, fearing they might reflect not his face but the souls of the men he had slain. Another claimed he dreamt of the fallen emperor Constantine, whose head he once displayed before the crowd. In the dream, Constantine said, "You took my city, Mehmed. But who will take yours?" He woke shouting. The man who once commanded vast armies now feared the echo of his own footsteps. He rarely appeared in public, and when he did, no subject dared meet his eyes. They said the fire within him had dimmed, yet his gaze still glowed like embers refusing to die. Venetian diplomats described him as a spirit trapped in flesh, pacing through marble halls, murmuring verses of the Quran, then stopping mid-sentence to whisper, "Do you hear them?" Who they were, no one dared ask. Still, his mind remained razor-sharp. He planned new campaigns, dreamed of Rome itself. He built fortresses along the Danube and gathered fleets across the Aegean. Europe trembled once more, yet the man leading the empire was already fading. Imagine that, the conqueror of worlds, terrified of his own halls. Rumors swirled. Some said he was poisoned by his son Bayezid, eager for the throne. Others whispered that the blood of his victims had cursed him, that even his veins rebelled. Officially, Mehmed II died in 1481, on campaign. Unofficially, the end was far less serene. One account tells that, gravely ill, he demanded his physicians heal him or share his fate. When he knew death had come, he ordered his tent sealed and gave one last command. Let no one see me weak. When they opened the tent the next morning, his hand still gripped the dagger he had kept under his pillow since boyhood. The empire mourned. The world exhaled. But death did not silence him. Soon came stories, fishermen seeing a rider in black armor crossing the Bosphorus at night, his horse gliding over the water toward the old city walls. Footsteps echoing in Topkapi's courtyards when the moon was full. And whispers beneath Hagia Sophia, behind a sealed iron door. Is the city safe? If the answer comes, yes, the voice replies. Then let me rest. Do you believe in ghosts, or in the kind of guilt that outlives its master? Centuries later, his name still divides the world. To some, he is the hero who united empires and built a capital that endures half a millennium. To others, the butcher who drowned an age in blood. Both are true, because that was his genius. He knew history is not written by the righteous, but by the survivors. And he made sure none survived him without remembering his name. In the end, the boy who once sharpened a dagger beneath his pillow became a man who sharpened empires on the blade of fear. He conquered walls, faiths, kings, even terror itself. But every empire learns the same truth, the blood you spill will one day call your name back from the dark. And somewhere, in the silence of the old city he once claimed, the shadow of the crescent still walks. Every age breeds its conquerors, men convinced they are chosen by destiny, who mistake destruction for creation. But the story of Mehmed II leaves a warning carved into every empire's ruin. Power bought with fear is never kept. It only waits, for the next hand to claim it. When Mehmed's heart stopped beating, his empire didn't breathe, it convulsed. News of his death raced across the Bosphorus, and before his body cooled, blood was already being spilled in his name. 2 sons. 2 armies. 2 claims to the crescent throne. Bayezid and Sem, brother against brother, as if the empire itself refused to exist without war. Guards who had sworn loyalty to the conqueror now turned their blades on one another. Viziers plotted in dark corridors. Servants fled the palace. The streets of Constantinople echoed with cries of betrayal. The empire he had built on order collapsed into chaos, the final reflection of a ruler who had governed through fear. It said his body lay hidden for days while the generals decided how to break the news. Some whispered his spirit would not depart until more blood was spilled. Others claimed that even in death he was listening, and that those who spoke against him felt their breath turn cold. When his body was finally carried through the city, the people watched in silence. No cheers. No wails. Only the slow rhythm of soldiers' boots and the wind sighing over marble. A chronicler wrote. The streets smelled of roses and of blood. The people feared he might rise again. Years before that funeral march, he had already erased the last trace of Byzantium. 8 years after taking Constantinople, he marched east to Trebizond, the final Byzantine bastion, the ghost of an empire that once called itself Rome. The city fell quickly. Its emperor, David Komnenos, was promised mercy, and 2 years later, executed with his sons. With that act, the last crown of Rome was extinguished, and Mehmed's world stood alone beneath the crescent. Then came the curse, whispered first by slaves, then soldiers, then the empire itself. Those who inherit his throne will inherit his madness. And perhaps they did. Bayezid began his reign by purging rivals and executing his brother's allies. When Sem fled, Bayezid pursued him across Europe, even into papal lands. It was as if Mehmed's spirit had divided between them, one ruled by ambition, the other by vengeance. Ask yourself, what kind of legacy makes even sons become weapons? Yet the most enduring inheritance was not written in bloodlines, but in memory. To the Muslim world, he was Fatih Sultan Mehmed, the conqueror, chosen by God, the man who fulfilled the prophets saying that Constantinople would fall to Islam. To Christian Europe, he became the beast from the east, the shadow of the crescent, a new Alexander born of darkness. Painters in Venice and Florence painted him with eyes that glowed and armor black as night. Preachers thundered that the Antichrist had walked among men. And in the East, poets wrote that he had become immortal, a ruler who would awaken when his empire was in peril. One legend says that beneath Hagia Sophia lies his sealed tomb of iron. If the city ever falls again, the door will break, and the Sultan will rise to ride once more beneath the crescent moon. Even centuries later, during the siege of Vienna in 1683, soldiers swore they saw him, a dark rider among the Ottoman ranks, his horse leaving no prints in the mud. And when the empire finally collapsed in the early 20th century, some claimed his ghost stood above the Bosphorus, gazing down at the ruins of what he had built. "You kept my empire," he whispers in their dreams. "But you lost my fear." Today, history calls him many names: conqueror, tyrant, visionary, monster. But Mehmed II was something deeper, a mirror of humanity's oldest hunger, the need to control, to dominate, to carve eternity from flesh and stone. He proved that empires rise not from justice, but from will. And that when fear becomes law, blood becomes history. His city, Istanbul, still stands. The call to prayer still echoes across the domes and minarets he raised. Tourists walk where his soldiers once marched, unaware that beneath their feet lies a foundation built on bone. And every time the muezzin's voice drifts over the Bosphorus, the wind seems to carry a whisper. Is the city safe? No one answers. Because everyone knows the truth, the city still belongs to him. He conquered walls. He conquered men. And in the end, he conquered even his own name. And maybe that's the real warning, that power bought with fear is never kept. It only waits, for the next hand to claim it.